In December of 1960, the Israeli government made public the construction of a nuclear reactor near the town of Dimona in the Negev desert in southern Israel. The project was, ostensibly, for producing cheap electricity to power desalination plants and irrigation, but its true purpose was to provide Israel with a supply of plutonium with which it could produce nuclear weapons. But in 1960, they were still the better part of a decade away from constructing their first atomic bomb, the program for which was to remain secret. Now, if you're interested in learning how the Israelis set up this secret program in the first place, then go ahead and check out this previous video. However, in this video, we are going to be focusing on how the Israelis finally built the bomb itself, and how the existence of it became a public secret. The 1960s would see a major transformation of US-Israeli relations, from the naive even-handedness of Truman and Eisenhower to the close partnerships we would recognize today. President Eisenhower took the first steps of this transformation in the closing weeks of his presidency, but it would be the newly elected John F. Kennedy that would solidify them. As a senator, JFK was quite vocally pro-Israel, publishing remarks on the 10th anniversary of its establishment in 1958 and speaking at the 1960 convention of the Zionist Organization of America. And as president, he would be less hesitant to sell arms to the Israelis.
Quite apart from the values and hopes which the State of Israel enshrines, and the past injuries which it redeems, it twists reality to suggest that it is the democratic tendency of Israel which has interjected discord and dissension into the Near East. Even by the coldest calculations, the removal of Israel would not alter the basic crisis in the area.
After coming into office in January of 1961, the new Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, reassessed Ben-Gurion's answers to President Eisenhower's 5 questions and was satisfied. But both the State Department and the CIA remained suspicious of the Israelis. Despite the more cordial relations when it came to arms sales, the Kennedy administration would be adamantly opposed to Israel developing a nuclear weapon. Part of this was Kennedy's policy of détente with the Soviets, pursuing an arms limitations agreement and making the Non-Proliferation Treaty permanent. If he wanted to be taken seriously on the issue, he couldn't play favorites with the Israelis. The more nuclear proliferation there was, the greater chance there was for a nuclear war. And if more and more countries, particularly in sensitive areas like the Middle East, developed nuclear weapons, there was a chance they might be used. When trying to rein in Israel's nuclear ambitions, JFK used Abraham Feinberg and Meyer Feldman, his deputy special counsel. After discussions with David Ben-Gurion, American inspectors would be allowed to visit Dimona in May of 1961. Shimon Peres and Mans Prat began preparing the site for a foreign visitor. Golda Meir feared that if any deception was discovered, it would sour relations with the US, and thus suggested that they come clean to the Americans. But Ben-Gurion pushed forward with keeping things secret. The Americans would be guided by Ephraim Katzir, who would show them around the above-ground parts of the facility. 2 days before the official visit, Israel's ambassador to the U.S., Mordecai Gazet, met with U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Philip J. Farley and hinted at the weapons purpose of Dimona to see what the American reaction would be and what they already knew. Farley would write a report about this meeting, and not only was he not surprised by the implications of the Israeli program, but he was actually supportive. When the American experts returned to the U.S., they reported nothing amiss. The U.S. would use these reports to help assuage the concerns of the Arab states. Kennedy and Ben-Gurion would meet on May 30th, 1961 in New York. In their discussion, Ben-Gurion said the purpose of the Dimona reactor was to produce cheap electricity so they could power desalination plants. But he didn't rule out the possibility of it being used to extract plutonium in the future. And whether that plutonium would be weaponized or not would depend on the situation in the Middle East. Kennedy, however, insisted that it was important that no one thought Israel was developing weapons, fearing that Egypt and Syria would start their own programs. The other factor that made Kennedy adamantly anti-proliferation was the Cuban Missile Crisis. After the crisis, JFK would meet with Israeli Foreign Minister Golda Meir in Florida. At this meeting, he publicly described the ties between the U.S. and Israel as a special relationship, which was usually reserved for describing relations with the UK. But Kennedy went further, saying,
I think it is quite clear that in the case of an invasion, the United States would come to the support of Israel. We have the capacity, and it is growing.
However, Kennedy was still pushing the Israelis to not weaponize the plutonium at Dimona, and was offering greater military aid in exchange for not pursuing the bomb. But Ben-Gurion rejected the demands for more inspections. largely because the reactor was due to become critical in 1963. But Kennedy was becoming impatient, and on June 16, 1963, he planned to send a message to Ben-Gurion, saying that they would send inspectors in early summer and again in June 1964, and afterwards in 6-month intervals. Kennedy's ambassador to Israel, Walworth Barbour, was sympathetic to Israel and understood the true intent of Dimona, and thus never went out of his way to uncover their nuclear ambitions. However, the U.S. ambassador in Egypt, John S. Badeau, was relaying a message that the U.S. was worried about the reactor at Dimona. The president felt it important to give serious consideration to Israel's strong desire for more specific security guarantees. He believes it is only through allaying Israel's fears about the long-range threat to its existence that leverage to forestall possible Israeli preventative warfare and to prevent proliferation of nuclear weapons can be maintained. The Israelis tried really hard to keep this program secret, which is understandable. I mean, we all have information that we would rather not fall into the wrong hands, which is why I am happy to talk about this video's sponsor, Aura. Back in February, my YouTube channel got hacked by a bunch of crypto scammers, which led to 5 of the most stressful days in my recent memory. Since then, I have been hyper-vigilant in making sure nothing like that could ever happen again. And a service like Aura is invaluable in doing stuff like this. Aura takes a comprehensive approach to protecting your personal data, which is why they provide a VPN, a password manager, antivirus software, parental controls, as well as providing identity and credit theft protection. Data breaches usually happen when someone is selling off your data. Aura can prevent these breaches by identifying these data brokers and automatically submitting opt-out requests for you. This will also help reduce the amount of junk mail and telemarketing you're exposed to as well. Aura also monitors your emails and passwords to see if they are involved in a data breach or exposed on the dark web, and will give you recommendations on what to do if they are. So go ahead and let Aura do the hard work of keeping you safe online. And if you sign up right now using my link, aura.com/casualhistorian, then you can get a 14-day free trial. Thanks again to Aura for sponsoring this video and helping keep people safe online. I would also like to thank my patrons for helping make this video possible. In particular, I would like to thank my newest patrons, Michael, Max, Nolan, Niall, Robert, and Evil Assault Weapon for joining over this last month. Patrons allow me to spend more time working on videos that entertain and educate and less on my boring day job. Not only do patrons get the satisfactions of helping more Casual Historian videos get made, but they also get special perks, such as getting to see videos early, getting access to a special Discord server just for supporters of the channel, as well as getting access to the scripts and notes I use to make these videos, and much more. If any of that sounds appealing to you, then you should check out patreon.com/casualhistorian to learn more. Thanks again to both Aura and my patrons for making this video possible. But for now, back to the history. Now, while all of this was going on, there was a shakeup going on within Israel's political establishment. David Ben-Gurion had been a major force in Israeli politics since the founding, and is not only responsible for getting Israel's nuclear program started, but also for saving it numerous times from forces inside and outside Israel. But doing this required centralizing more and more power into the hands of the Prime Minister and the Defense Ministry, treating the latter like his own personal fiefdom. He would take numerous actions without or against the approval of the cabinet, straining ties with former allies. On June 15th, Golda Meir found out that Israeli soldiers were training in Germany, which she had not been informed of, and went to Ben-Gurion to complain, fearing the public outrage. She asked Ben-Gurion to have the story censored, which the Prime Minister had the authority to do, but he refused. At this time, Kennedy's letter demanding Israel let American inspectors into Dimona had not yet been sent, but the Israelis were aware that it would soon be. On the following Sunday morning, Ben-Gurion told his secretary that he was going to resign. Now, some historians hypothesize that Ben-Gurion resigned in order to buy Israel more time in its negotiations with the Americans over inspections at Dimona. However, the actual evidence for this is non-existent. Rather, Ben-Gurion's resignation was ultimately due to him losing sway over the Mapai party, which was largely due to his centralization of power into the hands of the Prime Minister. The Minister of Finance, Levi Eshkol, would become the new Prime and Defense Ministers. He had initially opposed the nuclear program, but by 1963 he had come to accept their necessity in preserving Israel. On July 5th, the message Kennedy had tried to send to Ben-Gurion would finally be delivered to Eshkol.
I am sure you would agree that these visits should be as nearly as possible in accord with international standards, thereby resolving all doubts as to the peaceful intent of the Dimona project. As I wrote Mr. Ben-Gurion, this government's commitment to and support of Israel could be seriously jeopardized if it should be thought that we were unable to obtain reliable information on a subject as vital to peace as the question of Israel's effort in the nuclear field.
The Israelis were confused about why Kennedy was suddenly demanding these inspections with such severity despite 2 years of lax treatment. Ambassador Barbour claimed that it was the Cuban Missile Crisis, linking it to Kennedy's pursuit of a partial nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviets. Pressuring the Israelis would demonstrate to the Soviets that Kennedy was serious. The eventual treaty would be signed by Israel on August 5, 1963, which banned nuclear tests in the atmosphere and space. Ben-Gurion was a practitioner of realpolitik, but Eshkol was more experienced in compromise, and wanted to find a way of protecting the program without lying to the Americans. He posed the question to the cabinet: should we give up the nuclear option in exchange for security guarantees from the US? The main contention for the Israelis was not knowing what Kennedy meant by security guarantees. Moshe Dayan, serving as Minister of Agriculture, didn't trust U.S. promises of security. The Chief of the General Staff was also skeptical about the long-term viability of the guarantees, and Eshkol would agree with them. Eshkol was able to deliver a message through back channels to President Kennedy that Israel was not interested in the security guarantee because they could build a bomb, and therefore were not interested in inspections. Their official response was sent on August 19th, in which they agreed to let the Americans visit Dimona. But after Kennedy was assassinated, Johnson ascended to the presidency and would be far more friendly with Israel.
You have lost a good friend, but you have found a better one in me.
There are those who believe that the Israelis orchestrated the assassination of JFK, because of course there are, but there's even less evidence for this conspiracy theory than there are for most of the others. I'm actually kind of surprised I had never come across this version of the JFK assassination conspiracy prior to me researching the Israeli nuclear program. Anyways, back to Lyndon Johnson. Johnson came from a Christadelphian church, who were restorationist millenarians that placed a particular importance on how Christians treated Jews, whom they referred to as people of the book. They had similar views to what many dispensationalist evangelicals have, which placed not just a moral significance on the existence of Israel, but a theological and an eschatological importance as well. They believe that the end of days, and therefore the second coming of Jesus, cannot happen until after the Jews are gathered in the land of Israel. This facet of Johnson's life was mostly unknown and unreported at the time. Most of the world, including the rest of the United States, were unfamiliar with the nature of Southern Christianity until the 1980s, when evangelicals migrated over to the Republican Party during the Reagan years. Johnson would be far softer with the Israelis than Kennedy was, and he was far less focused on nuclear proliferation. The only condition on weapon sales Johnson made was that they couldn't be purchased directly from the US, but could be purchased from its allies in Europe. West Germany would become the primary supplier to Israel, but they did so on condition that the sales be kept secret. When preparing for a meeting with Johnson in 1964, Eshkol developed his own line on the nuclear question. Ben-Gurion had always said the reactor was for peaceful purposes, but Eshkol didn't believe anyone would buy it, so his line became, Israel will not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons to the Middle East. Johnson asked about letting IAEA inspectors in, but Eshkol refused, only permitting American inspectors. And unlike Ben-Gurion, Eshkol did not approve of the Americans sharing their findings about Dimona with the Egyptians. In October 1964, the sale of American tanks to Israel was leaked to the German media, and in February 1965, Chancellor Erhard ordered a halt to the sales, leaving 160 of the 200 ordered tanks not delivered. At the same time, King Hussein of Jordan began asking Johnson for patent tanks, because Egypt and Syria were pressuring Jordan to bulk up its forces. If he didn't get the tanks from the US, he would get them from the Soviets. But the Israelis didn't want the US selling tanks to a potential enemy. The only alternative that was able to satisfy the Israelis was to allow them to purchase tanks from the US directly. In this deal, the Israelis, in writing, said they would not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons to the Middle East. In 1965, Eshkol ran into trouble with Ben-Gurion over the Lavon affair, to which Eshkol and the Mapai rejected his call to action. Ben-Gurion's followers were still in the government and defense establishment, so Eshkol took the opportunity to clean out the stables and remove Ben-Gurion's loyalists, including those in the nuclear program. He charged Zvi Denstein with the task, who justified his actions on economic grounds. We wanted to introduce economic sense into the defense establishment, and that is what we did. It was a network that had evolved on its own. In some of its operations, there was no economic logic, and there was no control. I came there in order to question the conventions that Peres had dictated. Ben-Gurion would challenge Eshkol for leadership of Mapai in the 1965 elections, but the party rejected him 2-1. After his victory, Eshkol forced Peres to resign and made Ben-Gurion's remaining loyalists swear confidence in him. In response to his defeat, Ben-Gurion decided to form a breakaway party, Rafi, and a large number of young politicians followed him, including Peres and Dayan. In the general election, Ben-Gurion's supporters in the government claimed that Eshkol was endangering the nuclear program, despite Eshkol achieving what Ben-Gurion couldn't, keeping the nuclear program officially secret from the Americans, all the while opening direct arms sales. But Eshkol and Mapai still won. Eshkol would appoint Zvi Denstein as deputy defense minister, and Yitzhak Rabin would be elevated to chief of staff, aiding Denstein in cleaning out Ben-Gurion loyalists from the military establishment. Munya Mardor would also be dismissed, despite not being very political. Since becoming prime minister, Eshkol had slowly taken away projects from Raphael and given them to other institutions, especially the missile projects. This killed two birds with one stone. It cut down the state budget, which had grown out of control under Ben-Gurion, and it allowed him to tell Johnson that he was trying to de-escalate the arms race with Egypt. Bergman was out of the loop on the missiles decision, despite being the scientific advisor to the defense minister and head of research and development. He was still the head of the AEC, but this body had been made powerless. And since Bergman was a Ben-Gurion loyalist, he was not on Eshkol's good side. Bergman would resign on April 1st, 1966. After Bergman, Mans Prat, the director of Dimona, was also dismissed. Some warned Eshkol that replacing Prat would cause a catastrophe at Dimona, but the dismissal was justified by Prat's refusal to meet with Eshkol to report on the status of Dimona. Eshkol then began transferring special units from Raphael to direct control of the defense ministry. Munya Mardor would campaign to save Raphael. In a letter to Eshkol, Mardor said, "There is no way to understand a change in the organization of a project that has reached the state of assembly into a weapon system, but as an announcement of its failure." The reorganization, however, actually saved Raphael, and returning the missile projects to it. The AEC was given control and responsibility for the nuclear program. The new director of the AEC would be Israel Dostrovsky, and it would now be tasked with advising the government on all matters nuclear. Raphael was left in charge of the bomb itself, but they too would be under the jurisdiction of the AEC. A new scientific administration was set up under the Defense Ministry and placed under the leadership of Ephraim Katzir in June of 1966. Earlier that year, reports published in Europe stated that Dassault Industries in France had sold Israel 30 medium-range missiles, which sparked renewed concerns about Dimona. In May of 1966, Ambassador Barbour met with Eshkol to demand an answer on the missile question. Eshkol told him that there were no missiles in Israel and there wouldn't be any for another 2 or 3 years. But Arab media didn't stop discussing it. On May 8th, Nasser accused Israel of developing nuclear weapons and declared that he would obtain some as well, and they would seek to destroy Israel's capability to produce them. Israel achieved the technical ability to build and detonate a nuclear weapon sometime in the second half of 1966, in a process known as cold testing, where they test each step of the process independently. The critical mass proceeding test was performed in November 1966. This assertion is based on excerpts from Munya Mardor's diary. On November 2nd, 1966, a test of special import was carried out. It represented the culmination of a period in the development of one of the principal weapon systems and the step which brought it to the final stages of its development and manufacture at Raphael. The success of the test was complete, for we achieved through it unambiguous experimental proof of the efficacy of the system. We had waited many years for this result. The first major test for Israeli nuclear restraint would come in 1967. A coup in Syria the year prior had placed a radical Ba'athist into power, who began arming Palestinian terrorist cells to conduct cross-border attacks into Israel. They would also form a military alliance with Egypt. The exact reason for Nasser going to war with Israel in 1967 is uncertain. Some have speculated that he had grown concerned with the Dimona reactor and wanted to destroy it to prevent Israel from developing nuclear weapons, but most historians only place Dimona as a minor factor in his decision. Egyptian troops would enter the Sinai on May 15, 1967, and on May 16, Nasser demanded that the UN emergency force in the Sinai be evacuated. On May 17th, Egyptian planes began reconnaissance flights over Israel. 2 Jordanian jets also entered Israeli airspace, photographing Dimona. The cabinet didn't know if Dimona was the target, but protecting it was the primary justification in Israel's mobilization and preemptive strikes. In a May 21st cabinet meeting, Eshkol said, "In my opinion, the Egyptians will want to stop Israeli shipping in the Straits and to bomb the atomic reactor at Dimona. After that, a general offensive may ensue." Such an attack would create a humanitarian disaster unlike any seen before, and the fallout would hit Israel's most populous regions. On the eve of war, Israel had at least 2 working nuclear weapons, and despite the opportunity to use them, they didn't. There were calls to appoint a new defense minister, either Ben-Gurion or Moshe Dayan. Eshkol had asked Dayan and Peres to sit in on some of the cabinet meetings. Peres proposed that Israel should publicly state that it had nuclear weapons, which he hoped would prevent the Arabs from invading, but Eshkol and Dayan rejected it. Egypt was planning to attack on May 27th, which Israel warned Washington about the night before. The US would tell the Soviets, who tried to get the Egyptians to back down, and Nasser called off the attack. On June 15th, the Israeli Air Force attacked the Egyptian Air Force, knocking it out of commission. Documents released after the war would reveal that Dimona was one of Egypt's targets in the war. I would love to cover the Six-Day War in greater detail, but similar to the Suez Crisis, that is a story for another video. By 1968, US intelligence assessed that the Israelis had finally built nuclear weapons. The assessment came from Edward Teller, a Hungarian-born physicist who immigrated to the US during the 1930s. He worked on American nuclear weapons, earning him the epithet "Father of the Hydrogen Bomb." And unlike many other nuclear scientists, Teller was an ardent anti-communist. He met the Israeli physicist Yuval Ne'eman in 1964 when they were both working at Berkeley. They both believed that the Soviet Union's primary goal was the destruction of the West. Teller had spoken against Oppenheimer during the Red Scare, which ostracized him from much of the scientific community, as well as the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, which meant he had no ear in the White House. But he did have an audience in Israel, and he discouraged the Israeli government from signing the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Teller was imaginative, and was the one who gave Ronald Reagan the idea for the Strategic Defense Initiative, colloquially known as Star Wars. And while in charge of the Livermore Laboratory, he always kept the doors open to Israeli scientists. In 1968, Teller had a conversation with Ne'eman, in which he told him that he was going to tell the CIA that he believed the Israelis had a working nuclear weapon. Teller also encouraged Ne'eman to not keep this a secret from the US government. When Teller told the CIA scientific director, Carl Duckett, they asked if Israel was going to test it, and he said no. Initially, the CIA didn't believe him, but Teller eventually convinced them that the Israelis weren't going to test it, and that they should stop their inspections at Dimona. Eshkol visited Johnson's ranch in early 1968. Johnson told Eshkol that the US opposed introducing nuclear weapons to the Middle East, despite already knowing the Israelis had them. In October of 1968, Dean Rusk met with Abba Eban, Israel's new foreign minister, and demanded that Israel sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty in exchange for the continued sale of conventional weapons, but Eban refused. At this time, Yitzhak Rabin had been appointed as Israel's new ambassador to the US, and upon seeing President Johnson and the Democratic Party weakening, he sought to build rapport with the Republicans. Rabin would meet with Nixon in August of 1968. At the meeting, Nixon implied that if he were elected, he would greenlight the sale of arms. It is not enough to say that the Israeli ambassador in the United States is entitled to exploit political competition prevalent in the United States in accordance with its constitution. He must do so in order that his efforts will bear fruit. An ambassador who represents a state over which hovers a danger of extinction and who does not get involved in the fabric of American political life in order to use it to Israel's benefit, it would be better for him to go home. Nixon's own opinions about Israel had changed since his time as vice president. Back then, he had publicly supported President Eisenhower's handling of the region and of the Suez Crisis. But by the time of his second run for president, he was singing a different tune.
In retrospect, I believe that our actions were a serious mistake. Nasser became even more rash and aggressive than before, and the seeds of another Mideast war were planted. I have often felt that if the Suez Crisis had not arisen during the heat of a presidential election campaign, a different decision would have been made.
The Israelis desperately wanted the Phantom fighter jets, and Rabin promised Rusk and Johnson that Israel would not arm them with nuclear weapons. The State Department refused, and with Johnson distracted by Vietnam, Israel was not a top priority. The US and Israel decided to have the arms negotiations handled by their respective Defense Department and Defense Ministry. This placed Defense Secretary Clark Clifford in charge of negotiating with the Israelis. Despite this change, Clifford deferred to Rusk's policy of not selling weapons to Israel unless they gave up their nuclear program. Clifford had been a staunch supporter of Israel back in the Truman administration, being one of the people who convinced the president to support Israel. But since then, his opinion had changed. Clifford refused to meet with Rabin himself and sent Paul Warnke instead, who would keep the policy. The United States, France, Britain, China, and Russia, if not other former Soviet republics, all plan to retain nuclear weapons although faced with no external threats. Who will fault a beleaguered Israel for going nuclear? They could rely entirely on the US. Would I have done it had I been an Israeli policymaker? The answer is probably not. I think I would have been developing a nuclear capability. During the negotiations, Warnke handed Rabin a document that he never shared with journalists or historians, but Rabin would write this of it in his memoirs. Warnke took off his silken gloves, and claws that he bared transfixed me to my chair, and made my blood boil. As a condition for the supply of the Phantoms, the United States was demanding that Israel sign a shocking document, the likes of which no sovereign nation had ever been asked to sign. In the 5 years of my service in Washington, I never came across anything like it. The memo said that in exchange for the Phantoms, the U.S. will be given access to every place in Israel connected to the development of strategic weapons. Search imports into Israel, factories, and corporate offices. On top of that, they demanded Israel sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. These demands were rejected, and negotiations broke down. This was Warnke's reply to Rabin's rejection. It is the national security of the U.S. that I am charged with protecting. By law, I am required to consider the impact of the sale on the U.S. You, from your vantage point, do not have to accept my judgments, but I am required to make them. After the meeting with Warnke failed, Rabin reached out to Abe Feinberg and the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Arthur Goldberg, along with numerous other Democratic Party leaders, to speak with President Johnson. I dropped hints as heavy as elephants to Democratic Friends of Israel. A new president, if he is elected, will order that we be supplied the Phantoms as soon as he takes power, and he will get all the credit. I think it can be assumed that those who heard me hurried to the White House. Johnson would agree to sell the Phantoms without precondition. In January 1969, American media outlets started reporting that Israel was building the bomb. New York Times correspondent John W. Finney reported that sources in the Johnson administration had confirmed it. Paul Warnke is suspected to have been the leak. Eshkol died of a heart attack on February 26, 1969. He would be succeeded by Golda Meir. She visited Washington in September of 1969 and met with President Nixon. Kissinger had a different approach to nuclear proliferation than his predecessors. He focused more on limiting their enemies' nukes rather than hampering friendly countries' arsenals. Since 1968, Edward Teller's report about the Israeli nukes had seeped down to the State Department. By the time Meir visited in late 1969, the administration was mostly aware of them. The Nixon administration would never ask Israel to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty. In the talks between Meir, Kissinger, and Nixon, they came to the conclusion that the U.S. accepted that Israel had nukes, and that the U.S. would stop sending inspectors to Dimona. Israel, in turn, would follow the three no's: no acknowledgement, no testing, and no provoking the Arabs with it. Nixon also promised that, so long as he was president, Israel would never be left weak in conventional arms. During a visit to Egypt in 1969, Nasser criticized Kennedy's Israel policy in hopes of getting a positive reaction from Nixon, but Nixon didn't give him the response he was looking for.
His attitude towards Israel served his political purpose, beyond his blind intolerance of the Jews. If Israel had not existed, Nasser would have had to invent something to take its place. Arab unity needed a common cause, and the destruction of Israel filled the bill.
The first time Israel is alleged to have considered using its nukes was in the Yom Kippur War. On the evening of October 7, 1973, Moshe Dayan allegedly ordered nuclear bombs to be loaded on fighter planes, and nuclear warheads be fitted to Jericho missiles, and be readied to attack pre-assigned targets if the government felt the existence of Israel was at threat. This story has never been officially corroborated. Two contradicting stories exist about Golda Meir's response to Dayan's actions. One says she instructed him to cancel the orders out of fear the Soviets might detect it and threaten to use force, and the other claims that she told Kissinger about it and only canceled the order after Nixon ordered an airlift of weapons and ammunition to Israel. Both versions are based on shaky and fragmentary evidence. Neither the US nor Israeli governments have made public the relevant documents. Dayan called Mir Amit, the former head of Mossad, back into service and placed him in charge of managing the nuclear option. Dayan was stressed and didn't want to make a rash decision, but Amit claims that the use of nuclear weapons was at no point discussed. One of the sources for the rumor that Dayan had ordered the nukes loaded onto the planes would come from Israeli President Ephraim Katzir several years later. In a television broadcast, he said Israel armed an aircraft with a nuclear bomb, which was the first time any government official in Israel acknowledged the bomb, and the military censors had missed it. Other officials would have to deny Katzir's statements. Documents have revealed that, unlike Nasser, Sadat believed that Israel had nuclear capabilities, and because of this he narrowed his war aims to just getting the Sinai back. The peace talks after the war in 1973 dragged on for years. One of the reasons the Nixon administration didn't try to strong-arm the Israelis into a peace deal was because doing so, Nixon believed, would only empower the Soviets and their allies in the Middle East.
The potential for confrontation between the United States and USSR loomed large. If the Soviets were committed to Arab victories, and we were committed to Israeli victories, it did not require much imagination to see how we both might be drawn in, even against our wills, and almost certainly against our national interests.
By the end of the 1970s, most governments were either directly aware or indirectly certain that the Israelis had nuclear weapons, and aside from allegations in newspapers, to the wider public, it was still a secret. The existence of the weapons program would be exposed in 1968 by a former technician at the Dimona reactor, Mordecai Vanunu. He was born in Marrakesh, Morocco in 1952. His family immigrated to Israel in 1963 after a sharp rise in anti-Semitism, and they would be settled in Beersheba, which was an impoverished desert city at the time. At some point in high school, Mordecai would disassociate himself with Judaism. He was conscripted into the IDF in 1971, where he would be sent to the Combat Engineering Corps and served in the Yom Kippur War. After the war, he would enroll at Tel Aviv University, where he would study physics, but he would drop out for financial reasons. Despite this, he would find employment at the Negev Nuclear Research Center at Dimona. He signed a contract forbidding disclosure of security materials and had to swear he would never visit any Arab or communist country within 5 years of his employment ending. In 1979, he enrolled at Ben-Gurion University, initially to study engineering, but he would switch to economics and philosophy. His family, like many other Mizrahi Jews, were supporters of the Likud, but his own politics would change over the course of his education. He came to oppose the 1982 invasion of Lebanon, and when called into service, he refused to participate in active combat. While at Ben-Gurion University, he would become active in pro-Arab political groups, including being involved with pro-PLO activists. He began to resent Ashkenazi Jews. One of his professors at Ben-Gurion University, Dr. Ziv Tazor, said,
"He predicted a deep sense of deprivation. He assumed an Ashkenazi dominance in Israel that encompassed all social strata and an Ashkenazi consensus closing off all possibilities of an advancement for Oriental Jews."
These anti-Ashkenazi feelings would morph into anti-Jewish and eventually anti-Israeli sentiments. His security file at Dimona stated he had left-wing and pro-Arab beliefs. He would be investigated by Shin Bet, but would be let off with a stern warning. In early 1985, he lost his job at Dimona during mass layoffs, but due to a strong labor union, he got his job back. After he returned to work, he began smuggling a camera into the facility and proceeded to take 57 photos. He quit his job on October 27, 1985, after his superiors tried to get him transferred to less sensitive positions at the facility. In 1986, he would visit Nepal, where he visited the Soviet embassy, inquiring about travel documents he would need to visit. He would then visit Australia, at which point he decided to settle in Sydney, where he would convert to Christianity. There he would meet journalist Oscar Guerrero, who shopped Vannunu's story around until the Sunday Times in London showed interest. Vannunu would meet with Sunday Times journalist Peter Hunam. However, Guerrero would reach out to the Israeli consulate in August of 1986 and offer to help track down a traitor. He would hand over several copies of Vannunu's Dimona photographs. Shin Bet agents approached Mordecai's brother to persuade him not to tell the story. On September 10, 1986, Vannunu and Hunam flew to London. At this point, Vannunu violated the non-disclosure agreement of his contract when he told the Sunday Times about the weapons program, including the photos he had secretly taken. Based on his testimony, experts estimated that Israel had enough plutonium for 150 nuclear weapons. The Sunday Times approached the Israeli embassy with the story and offered it a chance to rebuke or comment on it. They were shown the photographs, which were rushed to Israel for review. Their response was to deny the allegations. The Israelis wanted to capture Vannunu but didn't want to harm Israel's positive relations with Margaret Thatcher, so they would lure Vannunu away from British jurisdiction. A Mossad agent, Cheryl Ventov, pretending to be an American tourist, befriended Vannunu and encouraged him to join her on a trip to Rome. After he arrived in Rome, Mossad operatives overpowered him and drugged him unconscious. He was then taken to an Israeli ship, the Noga. After noticing his disappearance, the Sunday Times would publish the story on October 5th. The Noga arrived in Israel on October 7th, where he would eventually be detained at Gadara prison. On November 9th, the Israeli government confirmed that it was in possession of Vannunu. He went to trial in August of 1987, where he was charged with treason, espionage, and collecting information with the intent to impair state security. His crimes were eligible for the death penalty, but it was decided not to pursue that. He was convicted on March 28, 1988, and sentenced to 18 years in prison, minus the time he had already spent in custody. A censored version of the trial script would be released in 1999. Vannunu served his sentence at Shikma prison in Ashkelon, being held in solitary confinement. Vannunu would claim that his time in solitary confinement was Shin Bet and Mossad trying to mentally break him, rather than the more obvious reason of Vannunu possessing classified information that they didn't want leaked. But he would be released from solitary confinement in 1998. He garnered a reputation for being a difficult inmate. He would go on hunger strikes and petition to have his Israeli citizenship revoked, but this was refused. He was up for parole numerous times, but it was denied because Vannunu refused to promise that he would never speak about the Dimona facility. He was released from prison in April 2004, but he had many restrictions placed on his rights of movement and speech. He was not allowed to leave Israel and could not speak with any foreign journalists. However, this didn't stop him from speaking. He called not only for Israel's nuclear disarmament, but also for the dismantlement of the State of Israel. Recordings from Shin Bet interrogations were made public after his release, in which Vannunu is heard saying,
"We don't need a Jewish state. There needs to be a Palestinian state. Jews can and have lived anywhere, so a Jewish state is not necessary."
To this day, probations placed on him after his release from prison have not been revoked. No matter which party controlled the government, his imprisonment and later these probations have been criticized not only due to Vannunu most likely not having additional national security secrets to expose, but also because Israel's possession of nukes is already an open secret. But Israel's policy of nuclear ambiguity is what prevents Vannunu from ever being fully freed. If Israeli authorities were to do so, that would be a tacit admission of Israel possessing nuclear weapons, which it had made agreements with the US to not reveal. Additionally, as mentioned earlier, the benefits of the status quo is that everybody knowing it exists gives Israel the desired deterrent power of a nuclear weapon, while nobody officially acknowledging it grants cover for the hostile regimes in the area to not have to pursue their own nuclear program. If the programs were officially acknowledged, many of the regimes in the region would be under pressure from their own populations to start programs of their own. During a press conference in Munich back in 2004, a Palestinian journalist asked U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld what he believed to be a gotcha question that would both demonize Israel and label the American government as hypocrites. "Mr. Secretary, you talked about countries that were trying to produce weapons of mass destruction. Why do you remain silent in regard to Israel?" To which Rumsfeld responded,
You know the answer before I give it, I'm sure. The world knows the answer. We take the world like you find it. And Israel is a small state with a small population. It's a democracy, and it exists in a neighborhood that in many, over a period of time, has opined from time to time that they'd prefer it not be there, and they'd like it to be put in the sea. And as a result, over a period of decades, it has arranged itself so it hasn't been put in the sea.
Thanks again to Aura for sponsoring this video. If you want to get a 2-week free trial, then go to aura.com/casualhistorian, or by clicking the top link in the description or in the pinned comment down below. And thanks again to my patrons for helping make this video possible. If you're interested in supporting this channel directly, then check out patreon.com/casualhistorian to learn more. If you enjoyed this video and have already seen part 1, then I recommend checking out this video I made about the Camp David Accords. You might also like this other video about Operation Orchard. It's this story about how the Israeli Air Force destroyed a nuclear reactor facility in Syria back in 2007. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.